Good evening, and welcome to this evening's event, Truth and ReconciliACTION, The Path Forward. My name is Lisa Kuntz-Samanuk, and I will be your MC here this evening. I'd like to welcome you here today on behalf of the Swift-Current Area Truth and Reconciliation Committee. We are pleased to have you here with us in person today to be part of our 5th annual event. And also I'd like to welcome those who are here with us virtually as well. Tonight concludes the last night of our 2-day event.
Hi, hello. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on Treaty 4 territory, the unceded and ancestral lands of Creek, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Nakota and Lakota Nation, and the homelands of the Métis people.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is asking Canadians to explore the past as a way of building a strong future for all people. To support reconciliation in our community, our local committee has hosted these events for the past 5 years. Last year we had our event, because of COVID, we had it held virtually. Our previous events have also had a learning and cultural component to them. Learning topics have included reconciliation, 60 Scoop residential schools, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, what does reconciliation mean to you, and most recently, a treaty flag raising ceremony. This year's event is a 2-part series taking place over 2 days, and today concludes those days. Our theme is ReconciliACTION, The Path Forward. This evening we will hear from Royce Pettyjohn about the rich history of the Métis Nation in our area. Mr. Pettyjohn spoke at our event earlier today. There is so much we can all learn about this rich history in our area. Many of you may not be aware of this history, or even that the Métis Nation is alive and well in our area, with a large population living among us. It is our responsibility to bring this out into the open, to celebrate and honor all our Indigenous peoples and heritage in the Southwest. We hope that you will learn something new today and perhaps be inspired to help us as we continue the path forward. Following Mr. Pettyjohn's presentation, we will open the floor for a question and answer period. You'll see on your tables paper and pencil so you can jot down any questions, and if you have a question, just hand it to Bula so that we can have it posted on the screen during our question and answer period. To begin, I'd like to call up Elder Sylvia Thorburn to lead us in an opening prayer.
Good evening. I always consider it an honor when people ask me or any of the elders to come forward and say a blessing. And I rarely ever know what to say. So I don't read from script. And I think about the Métis heritage that I heard today was really informative to me because I'm from Treaty 6. And I learned about the Métis in Duck Lake, where it was back to Batoche and Riel and all that area. So there's a different type of Métis history out here, which I was really blessed to listen to this morning. I'm going to say a quick prayer in Cree, and I'm going to ask for a blessing for the speakers and the elders that are going to do the smudge. And I'm just going to pray, okay? Hamaskum tina mantu ka pewi chikak tansi se kaitwa chika ayoge ka pe big squatchik ekwachim tagak ekwachim mantu ayoga ka kaya pichik kweskan tuhtakik wistawa and tuhtakik answers usam wistawa mstahegi wihtamakut when they were growing up but the we start in Dunakik, Gigway, Gunstotakik. And I thank the elders from Nikanik for traveling out here, Dale and Larry. And I asked the Creator to bless the speakers and just pray that we have a good evening and that we retain what we need to understand and take it with us and meditate on it throughout the week and think about where we should go from here. Manto esagi kwak. Manto entawehtak. Kwes kaisaya ik. Manto entawehtak. Kamyasikoma kaitotakik. Ham aksametan. I just asked the Creator to. It's a feel good day to understand history and culture and to bless the speakers that travel from Nikanik and anybody that's come here. And I just ask that the Creator would bless the speakers and all the history that they're here to share, and that everybody will feel good when they leave. Hi, hi.
Thank you, Elder Sylvia. Next, I would like to call up Elders Larry Oakes and Dale Mosquito from Nicanit First Nation to smudge with us and teach us a little bit about the importance of the smudge. We would ask that you stay seated during this time. Please feel free to ask to smudge later on if you wish.
Now, excuse me. So I'm very honored to be standing in front of you today. I feel really at home now. I've been here for a couple days, starting to know the streets. Reminds me a little bit about Calgary. You know, Calgary's not, streets are not built like this. They're like this and they're like this. So it's kind of neat to have that here. But I guess just to continue on with our presentation, Larry's going to be burning the sweetgrass.
knows where the washrooms are at the back. We'd ask that if you have a cell phone that you would silent that as well. And please make note of the exits. What we're going to do now is bring some greetings. The first person I'd like to bring greetings from is a recording from greetings from the City of Swift Current from our Mayor, Al Bridle.
Good evening. I'm Mayor Al Bridle, bringing greetings on behalf of the City of Swift Current. I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation events in our community, and I'm especially inspired by the theme of this event, the path forward to ReconciliACTION. It has been said that action speaks louder than words. Nothing could be truer when it comes to the call to action that have come out of the Truth and Reconciliation efforts here in Swift Current. Our local Southwest Truth and Reconciliation Committee is emphasizing calls to action about educational funding, changes to educational curriculum, youth program funding, and, finally, records for missing children from residential school tragedies. They recognize that a reconciled future for our communities belongs to the next generation, which is our path forward. Our collective healing comes first from the acknowledgement of tragedy, and then by moving through pain together, cooperatively pushing for change. On behalf of Council and the City of Swift Current, I would like to acknowledge and thank the presenters and speakers that have given their support, direction, and experience to this event. First off, His Honour the Honourable Russ Morasti, Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan. Niconet First Nation elders, both Dale Mosquito and Elder Larry Oakes. Métis Nation of Southwest Saskatchewan's Royce Pettyjohn. Minister of Veterans, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, Western Region 3's Representative Wendy Gervais. Bula Ghosh, Great Plains College and Southwest Truth and Reconciliation Committee member. I would also like to thank everyone who attended and participated in the events of the college and at Market Square, every heart that has made room for truth and reconciliation, and every foot that marched to bring attention to these critical steps on the path forward to action. Thank you.
I would now like to take the opportunity to thank a few more sponsors that have made the last 2 days possible. We greatly appreciate their ongoing support to make these events possible. As the Mayor mentioned, the Swift Current Area Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I think there's a few of us here as members of that tonight, and I would suggest that if you guys are interested, you could certainly join our committee. I am a community member, and I have joined, and we would all appreciate if you would like to join. Niconet First Nation, we very much appreciate them and the sponsorship from them. Our Métis Nation, Region 3, Local 35, the Southwest Multicultural Association, the Multicultural Council of Canada, or of Saskatchewan, SaskCulture, the Community Initiatives Fund, Chinook School Division, the City of Swift Current, the Southwest Newcomer Welcome Center, Great Plains College, Living Sky Casino, the Chinook Regional Library, where we are tonight, and their partnership with us, Tim Hortons, Safeway, and Starbucks. Before we ask for Royce to step forward, I'd like to take a minute to talk about our T-shirt. Our T-shirts were designed by 3 students at Maverick School. We worked together in creating the design. Aaliyah Holt, Mickey Episcanu Pelche, and Faith Pear. During the initial consultation of the logo creation, Mick had suggested that the outline of the turtle represent Turtle Island, and Faith proposed the idea of a pathway through trees. Aaliyah combined their thoughts and added the sun to create the final drawing. The trees represent the natural world, which has great importance in Indigenous culture. The pathway through the trees leads to the sun, which depicts moving to the brighter future that reconciliation strives to create. The T-shirt color green was chosen as it represents the natural world and is a color associated with healing. Because language has great importance on the path to reconciliation, it was determined that Indigenous language be used to represent the event's theme, the path forward in Cree, and walking in a good way in Michif. Aaliyah, Mick, and Faith hope that when people wear these T-shirts, they will be inspired to walk in a good way. And those of you here today, if you don't have a T-shirt, you can certainly go to Great Plains College. We have lots extra. Bula can give you a T-shirt. We'd appreciate that you wear them proudly around our community. And now, to our keynote speaker for this evening, Mr. Royce Pettyjohn. He's here with us today as a representative of the Métis Nation and will speak to us on the history of the Métis Nation in Saskatchewan, specifically the Cypress Hills area, and he'll share some stories with us from his own family history. Royce is a citizen of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, and he lives in Treaty 4 territory in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, where he grew up on a cattle ranch in the Cypress Hills area. Royce is a former park manager at Fort Walsh National Historic Site in the Cypress Hills, and a past president of the Museum Associations of Saskatchewan, a past chair of the Saskatchewan Heritage Foundation as well. Royce was fortunate to have and had a close relationship with his late grandfather, Willard A. Dumont, who passed on to him many stories of the Métis of the Cypress Hills. His grandfather also shared many of these stories in his memoirs, and Royce is pleased to continue to share these stories in celebration of the Métis history here in the southwest of Saskatchewan. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Royce Pettyjohn.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming out this evening. My cousin Tequila Friday, she's the vice president of the Métis Local number 35 here, and she'd reached out to me in a message asking if I would come and do a presentation on the history of the Métis in southwest Saskatchewan. And I was quite flattered that she would contact me and ask me to do that, and quite honored to come and do it. But one of the things that I realized right away is that covering the history of the Métis in southwest Saskatchewan is a little bit of a daunting prospect, because the story of the Métis here is a much broader story than one might imagine. We often think of the history of the Métis as being centered in Batoche and the events of 1885, but of course Métis history here on the Great Plains, certainly here in Saskatchewan and here in the southwest, is much longer and more complex than that. And one of the challenges, I think, with Métis history in the Southwest is that it's often a hidden history. It's one that isn't discussed very often. And part of that comes out of the cultural stigma associated with being Métis. A lot of Métis, particularly after 1885, didn't necessarily celebrate that identity, but more so wanted to fly under the radar, blend into the New World Order, and just get on with life. And as a result of that, a lot of people that were Métis wouldn't necessarily identify themselves as Métis. So people often thought that there really weren't that many Métis around, which wasn't necessarily the case. So I'm going to focus on Métis history in general, some of the things about Métis culture, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Métis specifically in the Cypress Hills region, which is still quite a big part of the Southwest. And I'll intersperse some of the comments with stories that my grandfather had shared with me as well. And we've been trying to get the technology to work, so hopefully it does. So as mentioned, I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. Through my mother's side of the family, I'm a Dumont. This is a photograph of my grandfather, Willard A. Dumont, and myself. And one of the first questions that I always get asked, when I indicate that my mother was a Dumont, was, "Oh, are you related to Gabriel Dumont?" And of course, yes, the answer is yes. And then the next question is, well, how? So the response is through my grandfather, Willard, his father, William, his father, Henry or Henri, his father, Vitel, and his father, Jean-Baptiste. And Jean-Baptiste was Gabriel Dumont's uncle. So Jean-Baptiste, his brother, was Gabriel Dumont's father. So Gabriel Dumont would have been a cousin. So that's the connection. So growing up in southwestern Saskatchewan, like most people, in school we learned about the 1885 resistance, and that was pretty much all we learned about the Métis. And I wasn't even really that aware of Métis history or culture, let alone my own connection to it when I was younger. And when I started working for the park system, Parks Canada, in the early 1990s, there was this brochure that came out, and it was all about the Métis of the Cypress Hills. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. And when it came into my hands, I opened it up and started reading it and learning about Métis presence in the Cypress Hills. But one of the things that really struck me about this brochure was the last paragraph. And if I can get it to come up here. It basically reads that after 1883, there was an influx of settlers in the southwestern part of Saskatchewan. They displaced the Métis, and the Métis left the area never to return. And that was really quite surprising to me because, of course, the Métis never left, and certainly there was many Métis that were still in the area. But what it represents, I think, is not necessarily just perhaps an oversight on the part of the people who wrote it, but really the perception about Métis in the Southwest. Because they were flying under the radar, they were trying to fit in. Many people didn't think there was Métis. They didn't think there was Métis history in this area. And so I think that brochure is really a sign of the times. And I think that's the point of the presentation here this evening and some of these events that are taking place, is shining a spotlight on that history that's been somewhat forgotten or somewhat just under the surface. So this is my grandfather and I, Willard Dumont, and fortunately he was raised in part by his grandparents. So as a result of that, he was raised by people that were still living a traditional lifestyle here in the Cypress Hills. He was raised by people that within their lifetime were buffalo hunters. So he was able to learn a lot about the Métis culture directly from his grandparents. And I was fortunate enough to be able to learn from him some of these stories before he passed away at age 94. And we're standing on either side of a photograph here, and that photograph is this one. And that's a photograph of his grandfather's cabin in the coulee in the Cypress Hills just up from Fort Walsh. And this is the cabin where he would have been raised by his grandparents, a very traditional, very small log cabin in the Cypress Hills. And this is a photograph of it in its heyday. His grandparents there, Henri and Melanie Dumont in the center, the cabin looking a little bit better condition than in the other photo, and some of their friends and relatives from around the area. So Henri Dumont was born in St. Boniface, Manitoba, which of course is the heartland of the Métis, really where the Métis culture was born and flourished. So the Métis were children of the fur trade, people of mixed ancestry, typically French Catholic men marrying Cree women, but that wasn't necessarily always the case. But the thing that's important about the Métis isn't necessarily their mixed blood, but the fact that they developed a distinct culture and identity, language, traditions, and customs that were unique unto themselves. So they became a distinct Indigenous culture, which would be separate from their First Nations roots and certainly separate from their European roots, something that was distinctly Métis and something that distinctly grew up in that Red River area. As children of the fur trade, the Métis were heavily invested in the fur trade. Many of them worked in the fur trade, working as voyageurs or laborers, working at trading posts and so on and so forth. And one of the things that came out of that period, which is still with us today in the Métis Nation, of course, is the Métis sash. You'll often see Métis men and Métis women wearing the sanche flèche, the Métis sash. And this is one that my grandfather was given a number of years ago, and another one that's on display at the museum at Maple Creek. Now, these sashes today have taken on a symbolic and sort of iconic purpose or role for the Métis, but historically they had a very distinct relationship with the fur trade itself. Many of these Métis who were working in the fur trade were working as voyageurs, and they were carrying supplies by York boat and canoe up and down the river systems here in Saskatchewan. And when they came to an area that they couldn't traverse by boat, rapids or something like that, they'd have to take everything out of the boats, they'd have to put the boats on the shore, everything would have to be portaged, and they'd have to lift these heavy boats and these heavy canoes and these heavy packs that would be filled with trade goods or fur bales. So these Ceinture flèches were actually used as basically lifting straps or back braces for these men that were doing this heavy lifting during the fur trade. And then it evolved just to become part of the dress, traditional dress of the Métis. And interestingly enough, this is a photograph of a group of Métis men in Maple Creek around the turn of the last century. And I think one of the things that's really remarkable about this is none of these men are actively involved in the fur trade, but they would have been working as cowboys on some of the cattle ranches in the Cypress Hills. And even though they're no longer portaging boats, you can just make out that two of them are wearing ceinture flèches around their waist as belts, and one of them is actually wearing moccasins as well. So in Maple Creek, you could certainly encounter people that were dressed in traditional garb. This is a fabulous photograph from Maple Creek showing a group of men standing in the front door of a business, and we've got a man standing in the front doorway as well, who's either First Nations or Métis, possibly Métis, but also you can see he's distinctly wearing moccasins as well. And that's early in the 20th century in Maple Creek. So a lot of this traditional dress was carried on well into the early and mid 20th century. One of the other things about the Métis was that they were Catholic, and this is a great photograph of Métis at Maple Creek, and you can see the woman just to the side of the stove there. If you look around her neck, you can see she's wearing a large crucifix and a cross, and certainly some of these crosses have been found in the Métis settlements in the Cypress Hills as evidence of that French Catholic heritage. But the interesting thing I think about that heritage is that because the Métis are often on their own on the prairie, and often having to deal with their own spiritual matters, not having a church to go to, not having ready access to priests. They would innovate, I think, in some ways with their faith and their religion, sometimes taking on worldview that would be more in keeping with First Nations than European. And one of the stories that my grandfather told of his grandparents when it came to their religion was, in the absence of a priest in a church, they wanted holy water. They needed holy water. And so what would typically happen is a priest would bless water and it would become holy water. But instead, what would happen is they would do it themselves. So at the solstice in the spring, my great-great-grandfather would go onto a high hill above where they lived in the Cypress Hills, and he would wait until he could see the sun just coming up over the horizon. And when he could see that sun, first ray of light in the spring, he would fire a rifle off into the air, and that was the signal to his wife, my great-great-grandmother, who was down at the spring, and she would scoop out a bucket of water, she would say a prayer, and that would become their holy water for the year. And they would distribute that through the Métis community as well in the Cypress Hills. And they always maintained a little container of water by the door, and every time you came in and out of the cabin, you were expected to dip your fingers and do the sign of the cross. And and I think that's not necessarily mainstream Catholicism, but something that they adapted and became distinctly Métis. Now, the first Métis that were coming into southwestern Saskatchewan, obviously were coming in here through the fur trade. And this photograph is the South Saskatchewan River near the confluence with the Red Deer River up near Leader, Saskatchewan. And that was an area where there were a series of fur trade posts that collectively was just known as Chesterfield House. And Chesterfield House was basically a bison trading post. They would trade pemmican and bison robes and so on and so forth. Not as many fine furs as perhaps they would trade up north. So the men at Chesterfield House, Métis, and even the chief factor, Peter Fiddler, was Métis. They headed out from Chesterfield House across the prairie south into the Cypress Hills. And if any of you have ever driven from Leader, Saskatchewan to the Cypress Hills, it's quite a large open, flat area. It takes about an hour to drive, so certainly much longer on foot and by horse. But the reason that they were heading south from Chesterfield House to the Cypress Hills was that the Cypress Hills, Cypress Hills is the only place on the prairies in Canada where a lodgepole pine forest occurs naturally. And as a result, the Cypress Hills have always been tremendously important for First Nations people, not only for the plants and animals that live there, but these trees. And these were used for travois and teepee poles. But for these guys that were coming down from Chesterfield House, they were specifically coming to get pine resin. And they were coming for the pine resin because they were using it to waterproof canoes and boats and whatnot back at York Factory. And I think one of the other things that's interesting about the Cypress Hills that a lot of us perhaps don't recognize is the very name of the Cypress Hills is derived from the Métis. The Métis' name for the Cypress Hills was Les Montagnes de Cypre, the Jack Pine Mountains when you translated it. But of course that was anglicized to Cypress Mountains and Cypress Hills. So often people wonder, you know, where are the cypress trees in Cypress Hills? Well, there aren't any. Cypre being the French-Canadian or Métis word for Jack Pine. So the Métis were partly sedentary, partly living off of the land as farmers. They had a very distinctive river lot system, and they would, on their river lots, grow gardens, grow crops, and raise animals. But they were also bison hunters. And the bison were extremely important to the Métis, their culture, their identity, their livelihood. And so often you see a buffalo associated symbolically with the Métis, equally to that of the First Nations. And these Métis buffalo hunts would be very large undertakings, and they would organize them often as many times as twice a year with military precision. There was large groups of people that would come together. They would go out on the prairie and they would pursue the bisons in this large-scale hunt. And when you have a large number of people doing a large-scale undertaking, there needs to be very clear rules, there needs to be a very clear hierarchy, and that was all organized by the Métis prior to even departure. And if you didn't follow the rules, there were consequences for that. And if you Google the rules of the buffalo hunt, you can certainly read them and go through them. And I think that's really quite interesting. One of the things also about this almost military type operation that they were operating with these buffalo hunts was the packing list. And I came across a packing list of the things that they would take with them on the buffalo hunt. And of course things like Red River carts and guns and blah, blah, blah. But on the list, they indicated that they would take 2 cats. And this is a picture of my great-great-grandparents and their granddaughter with a cat. And certainly in the family photographs, you see all of these cats all of the time. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, because I often wondered when cats were first introduced onto the prairie. And apparently it would have been the Métis bringing them on these buffalo hunts. And you would think you'd bring hunting dogs, which perhaps they certainly did. But the cats played a very important role, because of course, if you're living out on the prairie and you're hunting and gathering stuff, pemmican, you're not going to want to have mice coming into your carts. So certainly it makes sense that they'd be bringing these 2 cats. And then this is another photograph. That's my great-grandmother, possibly my grandfather, and the kid on the right there, another cat. So these cats just keep showing up over and over again. And I think that's because they had a role to play in this buffalo hunt. Okay, so once the buffalo hunt was successfully completed, they had to start the process of processing the bison carcasses. The buffalo hide had great value as a trade good, but also they'd be using it for domestic purposes. My grandfather talked about his grandparents' beds always had buffalo robes as comforters on them well into the 20th century. And because there was no refrigeration, this buffalo meat was being dried. And my grandfather talked about his grandmother doing this very thing, cutting the meat into thin strips, putting them over trestles near smoky fires, and drying the meat out until it was very dry and hard. And the idea is that that would preserve it, but it also made it possible to pound it into a fine powder and then pack it into tight rawhide sacks and create pemmican. And pemmican was a really important foodstuff for the Métis because it was a way to have protein and meat that wouldn't spoil. You could house this and carry it around on the prairie for prolonged periods. So it was certainly something that they would use themselves, but because of the sort of industrial level that they were doing hunting and pemmican making, they were producing more pemmican than what they needed for their own consumption, and they were then using the surplus as a trade item or a sales item to the fur trade. Because the fur traders had the same need for pemmican as the Métis. They needed a good source of protein, a food item that wouldn't spoil out on these treks between trading posts. So that was an important part of the Métis economy, was this sale in pemmican into the trading posts, into the trade system. And to get out onto the prairie in pursuit of the bison, the Métis had devised the Red River cart. And of course today, like the Centre Fléché, the Red River cart has become part of the identity of the Métis. These carts were based on French peasant carts, but they had a very distinctive Western Canadian or Métis twist to them. They didn't have any metal in them whatsoever when they were constructed. They were just wood on wood. And that made them very easy to repair. If they ever broke down out on the prairie, they just needed to find a stand of trees and they'd be able to do the repairs. And the wheels, unlike wagon wheels that we think of today that has that iron band around the outside of it, the Red River carts had rawhide. They would wrap rawhide onto the wheel when it was wet, and when it dried it shrank and held the wheel together and was very tough and durable. And that rawhide was known as Shaganappy. So many of you probably, if traveling in Calgary, maybe had seen the Shaganappy Trail. That's an allusion, of course, to these Red River carts. And the Red River carts, because they were just wood on wood, they would squeak and they would squeal and they would grind as the hub rubbed onto the axle. And they wouldn't grease it because, of course, it was kicking up dirt and sand and it would become abrasive. So you could just hear these Red River carts coming for miles away, squeaking and squawking as they crossed the prairie. And they did travel for many miles, the Métis. Today, you know, we sometimes feel it's inconvenient to drive an hour and a half to Swift Current or 4 hours to Regina. But the Métis didn't seem to bat an eye when they were having to cross great distances. And as time went on, they were coming further and further west from Red River. And certainly after the smallpox epidemic had reduced the population of the Blackfoot, it was easier for other groups to start coming into this area, particularly the Métis. And they were coming into southwestern Saskatchewan, into places like Wood Mountain and certainly the Cypress Hills. And they would be coming in pursuit of the bison, of course. Now, the Métis that were coming into the Cypress Hills during that period would be staying over winter. And they would usually stay even just in simple canvas tents. My grandfather, when I asked him, you know, what did they stay in when they were out on the prairie? And he said, oh, they just had tents. You know, so it was nothing for them to spend a winter in a tent. And he said in some cases, if there was good timber, they would throw up a rudimentary cabin. And certainly the Métis that overwintered in that early period in the Cypress Hills would have done just that. So I imagine it would have looked something much like this photograph here. And these overwinterers in the Cypress Hills were known as hivernants, overwinterers. And although in the early years they would overwinter and they would typically head back to the Red River, but as time wore on, rather than returning back to Red River, some of the Métis were staying out on the prairie. And my own family, rather than returning to Red River, they basically took up the life of being on the prairie and being nomadic bison hunters. And so these settlements in the Cypress Hills started to become larger and they started to become more permanent in nature. And so when Catholic missionaries were coming through to do baptisms and marriages and confirmations and whatnot amongst the Métis, they were reporting the number of Métis that were starting to be present in the Cypress Hills and almost on a permanent basis. And they referenced there being about 200 families of Métis living in the Cypress Hills by the mid to late 1870s. And these 200 families, they reported, were living in three primary settlements, and those were Chimney Coulee at East End, 4 Mile in the west block of the Cypress Hills, head of the mountain near Elkwater, and then they referred to 20 other smaller settlements throughout the area. And to give a sense of the permanence that these settlements were taking on, the 3 major settlements had consecrated Catholic chapels. So they actually had a church in the settlement that they would use repeatedly year after year after year. The artifacts that you see in the photograph are beads and glass and chinaware that were excavated at the west block at the 4 Mile settlement. And aside from these Métis settlements that were springing up in the Cypress Hills, they were joined in the Cypress Hills by fur traders. And not like the fur traders that they had worked for In Canada, these were American fur traders, American whiskey traders. And in the United States, it was illegal to trade alcohol to First Nations people. It was certainly also illegal in Canada at the time, but in the United States, they were starting to enforce the law. And as a result of that, these American traders decided to just pop across the border, head a little bit further north. They'd be able to, out of American jurisdiction and into what they considered the unoccupied British possessions in the Northwest Territories. And the Cypress Hills made an ideal place to come and do whiskey trading. There were certainly lots of materials to build trading posts, and there'd be lots of customers, First Nations people in the vicinity of the Cypress Hills with lots of furs and buffalo robes to come and trade. And the Métis could get work with the trading posts either as freighters hauling goods up from Fort Benton, Montana. So with their Red River carts and other wagons, they'd be able to bring up things like pots and beads and blankets and guns and gunpowder and so on and so forth. And then probably for the whiskey trade, more importantly, they needed fast carts that could bring up the little square canisters of alcohol that they would use to make the whiskey. So certainly there was freighting contracts to be had during this period of time. At these trading posts, they could get work as laborers, putting up horse feed, taking care of the horse herd, building trading posts, cutting timber, pressing fur bales, and so on and so forth. But probably more importantly, they played the role of interpreters and intermediaries. Most of the Métis were famous for being able to speak many different First Nation languages in addition to French, English, and Métis, the Métis language. So in order to facilitate the trade, they would be there to translate and interpret and facilitate the trade between the First Nations and the American traders. This all came to a head, unfortunately, on the Cypress Hills Massacre, June 1st of 1873, when a group of American wolf hunters and whiskey traders attacked a group of Nakota in a drunken misunderstanding over a missing horse. And following that incident, many of the Métis that were involved in the Cypress Hills Massacre headed towards the east, fleeing from the scene. And they went to one of these Métis settlements, the one at East End, Chimney Coulee. And the Métis at Chimney Coulee, the Nakota, reported, welcomed them into their community and treated them kindly and provided them with dogs and kettles, like the trade kettle you can see there, in order to help them get back on their feet again. Now, shortly after the massacre, the Northwest Mounted Police March West took place, the first Mounties coming out west in 1874. Famously, they rode into the Battle Creek Valley in June of 1875 and erected Fort Walsh to express Canada's sovereignty over a lawless and unoccupied West. And unfortunately, of course, that wasn't necessarily true. It wasn't a lawless West because there were certainly Indigenous laws for the First Nations and Métis and cultures and societies and even settlements that existed long before the Mounties arrived. And even though the fort, was always believed to have been built on unoccupied territory, it was actually built right beside a Métis settlement. Prior to the police arriving, Edward Mackay already had settled there. He had a trading post and a farm and gardens and cows and so on and so forth. And the Métis family, the Mackays, would later suggest that perhaps the real reason the Mounties wanted to build in their backyard was that Edward had a number of eligible young daughters. And a few of them did ultimately marry members of the Northwest Mounted Police. But for the Métis, the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police also provided job opportunities. The Métis were regularly engaged by the Northwest Mounted Police as scouts and guides, interpreters, spies, and paid informants. These are some of the scouts and guides and whatnot that worked for the Northwest Mounted Police in the Cypress Hills area here. And some of them would be entrepreneurial, and they would take advantage of the Mounties being here as a customer. This is Jules Quinnell's pack saddle. He went into Montana and gathered up horses and drove them into Canada so that he could sell them to the Northwest Mounted Police. Of course, after the March West, many of the Mounties' horses had died or were incapacitated and they were in need of remounts. So he took advantage of this economic opportunity and sold them some horses. Famously, the Northwest Mounted Police had their guide, Jerry Potts. And he, of course, led them from Fort Benton, the Sweetgrass Hills, up into Fort Whoop Up and Fort McLeod. But for our area here, probably more famously, the head interpreter and scout at Fort Walsh was a fellow by the name of Louis Lavallee. And Louis Lavallee was actually among the original Métis scouts that led the Northwest Mounted Police into Western Canada in 1874. And then later, he famously led Superintendent Walsh into Sitting Bull's camp when they arrived in Canada following the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. And certainly Louis Lavallee would have served in that same role as an interpreter and translator. So around this same time period, I'll talk a little bit about my own family. Vital Dumont, which would have been my great-great-grandfather's father, they were one of these groups, sort of an extended family group that were living out on the prairie and hunting the bison. And in one of the government documents that I was able to come across, it talked about his family being a buffalo hunting family and living at various locations: Swift Current, Maple Creek, Cypress Hills, Fort Assiniboine, Fort Benton, Batoche, basically of no fixed address. And they would be out on the plains. And they were here in the Cypress Hills area around the time that the Lakota had come into Canada. And we know that because in the documents, Grandpa Henry had a brother that was born at Fort Walsh in 1879. And so they would have been here around the time that Fort Walsh was becoming headquarters and when the Lakota were here in Canada. And when we think of history, often we think of large monumental activities, you know, the founding of the police, the establishment of the fort, the Lakota coming to Canada. And one of the things that I found fascinating in my grandfather's stories is that his grandfather told a story around this time of how all of this affected them. It's just one little snippet in history, which I found really quite fascinating. But basically, they were out on the prairie pursuing the bison. They had stopped for the evening. They had made camp. And at that time, you always posted someone to watch over the camp at night, lest someone sneak in and try to take off with some of the horses. So it was Grandpa Henry's job that evening, as the young man in the camp, watching over the camp at night. So he was on point duty. And it was a boring evening until he could start hearing voices coming closer and closer to the camp. And he could sort of make out figures coming closer to the camp. And he could start to understand what they were saying. And it sounded like they were speaking Lakota or some sort of Sioux language. And they got closer, and the closer they got, the more panicked he became. And he wasn't certain exactly what to do. So as they got really close, he called out to them. He said, "Well, I can hear you, I can see you. If you're coming to steal our horses, we don't have that many, and what we have, we need for ourselves. And if you're looking for horses, there's another camp over the hill, and they've got more horses and better horses." And with that, it became very silent, and then he couldn't see movement anymore, so he figured that they had been spooked away. So I like that story just because it's a snapshot, one evening in history during this period when the Lakota were in Canada, in between Wood Mountain and the Cypress Hills. One of the other things the Mounties did is bring a focus point for commerce in the Cypress Hills. There was a village that sprang up near the fort, and there was a number of trading posts and stores and other businesses there, and that provided an opportunity for both First Nations and the Métis to come and trade. And the primary thing that they were trading at the village of Fort Walsh was bison robes. There was great demand in the United States during this period for bison robes for domestic purposes as well as for industrial purposes. And so there was a great premium being paid for bison robes down in the US. So they'd be able to bring these bison robes in and trade for goods. And that is a great photograph of a group of Métis hunters coming into the village at Fort Walsh with their Red River carts laden with furs and buffalo robes ready to do trade. So that was a benefit, I guess. It created a focal point for commerce. But the problem with that, of course, is it came at the expense of the bison. The trade in the Cypress Hills was very brisk and very successful and peaked the winter of 1878 to the spring of 1879 when nearly 20,000 buffalo robes were traded in the village of Fort Walsh alone. And following that trade season, the buffalo population in Canada crashed, and the bison herds failed to return north into Canada in the spring of 1879. So effectively, by the spring of 1879, the bison were extirpated from Canada. And of course, for the cultures that relied on the bison, the First Nations and Métis, certainly settlement or starvation had started to set in. And these are some sort of remarkable images of the bison. Anyway, so for First Nations in the vicinity of the Cypress Hills being one of the last areas in Canada really where the bison could be found in any numbers towards the 1870s. So there was increased interest in the Cypress Hills, and there was probably about 8,000 or more First Nations in the Cypress Hills region pursuing the last of these bison herds. And certainly the Métis would have been in that area too. And when the bison disappeared, many of them would try to pursue them across the border in the United States, which was causing diplomatic problems with the United States. And some of the leaders would come to the fort and they would enter into treaty. Now, of course, most of the numbered treaties had been signed by this period, but there was a number of chiefs that had either been absent from the original treaty signing or had refused to take treaty at the original treaty signing, who would come to the fort to sign a treaty adhesion. And here in the southwest at Fort Walsh, there were 6 treaty adhesions that were signed, 3 to Treaty 4 and 3 to Treaty 6, and Chief Big Bear being one of the last to sign treaty in December of 1882. And I think perhaps the timing of that treaty signing in December perhaps is a bit telling about the motivating factors in going into treaty. And for the Métis, they in like manner were wondering what was going to happen in this post-Buffalo world. And so the Métis of the Cypress Hills, they were petitioning to have something akin to treaty, or at least a reserve. They were wanting to, in 1878, for the Dominion government to create basically a bison preserve in southern Manitoba, which extended a little bit into southeastern Saskatchewan. And the idea was it would be an effort to preserve the remaining bison, and it would also become a hunting preserve for the Métis. Unfortunately, the Dominion government ignored the petition and preferred instead to deal with Métis claim to territory through scrip. And scrip was each individual would get a little bit of land or a little bit of money. And unfortunately, the scrip process, was not necessarily the most satisfactory way of dealing with some of these claims. And scrip is a very convoluted topic that could be its own presentation in and of itself. So I won't go into it in great detail. So what happened to the Métis here in the Southwest after the bison? Well, many of them would have to leave bison hunting and get other occupations. Certainly they could continue to work for the Northwest Mounted Police as scouts, guides, interpreters, spies, and whatnot. This is a photograph of some Métis that worked for the Maple Creek A Division, Northwest Mounted Police, and they were actually hired to do hunting. And after the treaties were signed, the treaty adhesions were signed, the First Nations in the Cypress Hills were encouraged to move to reserves away from the Cypress Hills, partly because the Dominion government wanted everyone away from the international boundary because everyone was going across the border to pursue the bison, and that was creating tensions with the American government. So the idea is get them away from the bison, get them away from the border, get them out of the Cypress Hills. Chief Nickonede, of course, being the only one that refused to leave and remaining in the Cypress Hills. But some groups that left ended up coming back, and when they got back, the fort was gone, the Indian Department stores were gone, there was no way of provisioning them, and it was quite late in the year. And so rather than being able to go back to the reserve, they had to stay in the Cypress Hills. They went down to Cypress Lake, they were issued fishing spears, encouraged to fish, hunt, and the Métis would augment hunting and feeding some of these people through that terrible winter. One of the other things the Dominion government did in the Cypress Hills is create 2 instructional farms. And the idea was that they were going to teach First Nations people how to become farmers. The idea being that if they could learn to become self-sufficient, they wouldn't have to provision them under the terms of treaty. And these instructional farms were somewhat successful, mostly not successful, but they created another opportunity for Métis to get jobs. They would be hired on to assist with these farming operations as farm hands and laborers and so on and so forth. And then the bison themselves. Even though the bison were gone, there was still a bit of a bison economy. for the Métis. Scattered across the prairie here in the southwest would have been thousands and thousands of bison bones from the buffalo that had been slaughtered in the years leading up to the late 19th century. And what would happen is the Métis would head out onto the prairie with their Red River carts, and they would gather up as many of these bones as they could fit in the back of the cart, and they would bring them into the nearest settlement, where they would sell them to a local merchant, and the local merchant would stockpile them along the railway tracks. And one of the things I was able to come across, Grandpa Henry's brother, Louis Dumont, in 1893, was identified in one government document as having the occupation of a bone picker, somebody that was going around picking bones, taking them into the railway. And this photograph is Maple Creek, and you can see the pile of bones there. Of course, famously, Regina at one point was known as Pile of Bones. Anywhere there was a railway stop where there was merchants that were interested in purchasing bison bones, you would have these piles. And as soon as there was enough in a pile to fill a boxcar, then they would rent a boxcar, fill it up, and they'd be sent east and processed into fertilizer and other products. So that, of course, wasn't all that the Métis had to do. They had to find other jobs as well. Grandpa Henry ended up going down into Montana. Ranching had started earlier in Montana than here in Canada, so there was opportunities to work on ranches as cowboys and laborers. So he worked in the United States for a little bit as a cowboy on a ranch in the US. And then when they started the construction of the Great Northern Railway through northern Montana, he was able to get on with the Great Northern. And in the summertime, they worked as laborers building the grade for the tracks. And then in the wintertime, they would work in tie camps. And in the Sweetgrass Hills, just south of the Canadian border, there were tie camps set up in the hills. Métis settlements, the Métis labored all winter, cutting trees, forming them into ties, so they'd have these ready for the next summer's construction season. And during the period that he was working on the Great Northern Railway, he decided to send his oldest children, my great-grandfather and his sister Mary, to industrial school at Fort Shaw in just sort of southern part of Montana. And I think the idea behind that was that he was concerned about the fact that there was no more bison, there was no way to continue with a traditional life, and he wanted his children to have an education that would allow them greater opportunity in the new economy, in the new world order, the mainstream Canadian society. And unfortunately, I don't know that that necessarily, the way it played out was exactly the way he had hoped. The industrial school at Fort Shaw was akin to the residential school system here in Canada, operated by the government, run by the Catholic Church. And they would teach the students to read and write and different skills, including farming and gardening and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, the school was also notorious for, psychological and physical and sexual abuse. And my great-grandfather was among some of the young people there that did suffer at some of this abuse. And it got to the point where he couldn't take it anymore. So he ended up deciding to try to run away. And of course, in those days, when you tried to run away, you were looking at hundreds of miles of open prairie in any direction. Here in Canada, there's certainly stories too of young people trying to run away from residential schools and many of them not making it. So when him and his young friend decided to run away, they had their work cut out for them. And they managed to go from basically a more southern part of Montana across the open prairie, crossing two major rivers, and making it all the way back to the Sweetgrass Hills, where fortunately he was reunited with his parents. And how they managed to survive, I don't know, but one of the stories my grandfather talked about was that they would try to hunt rabbits with rocks, trying to find rabbits and then stone them so they could at least have a rabbit to eat. Aunt Mary did stay at the school, and she got her education when she came back to Canada. She was actually able to get work for some of the homesteaders that were coming in because, of course, schools were not that common. Homesteaders that wanted their children to be able to learn to read or write, they would give Aunt Mary a little bit of a contract. They'd set up kind of a salt box or a granary as a little classroom, and she would teach some of the settler children how to read and write. And when my great-grandfather came of age, like many of the Métis, he was able to get work as a cowboy. And it was very desirable for a lot of the ranches to hire Métis because they were familiar with the prairie, they were good horsemen, and as it turned out, were good with cattle and made good cowboys. And this is a picture of him working for the Spencer Brothers, which was a big open range ranch outfit that operated in the Cypress Hills region. They would have ranged about 12,000 head of cattle between Milk River and the Cypress Hills in the early part of the 20th century. This is a great grub pile photograph, roundup camp of the chuck wagons, and there's Grandpa Willie there in the group. And when you look at these grub pile camps, you think of, you know, the old westerns of the cliche, the cowboy sitting around a campfire with a chuck wagon in the background playing the harmonica. And I always thought that was perhaps a bit of a cliche, but according to my grandfather, he said that it was actually true. His father told him that they did do that. They sat around the campfire at night and played the harmonica. And the reason for it is that it was soothing to the cattle and they would bed down more easily and sleep through the night without wandering off too far. Because of their horsemanship skills, many of the Métis also had quite prominent rodeo careers. This is Alec Laframboy from Maple Creek, who is a prominent rodeo cowboy Métis, and famously won the bucking horse competition at the Second Calgary Stampede in 1913. So, and for some of the Métis, with the influx of homesteaders, many of them decided to homestead themselves. Grandpa Henry came back to the Cypress Hills, chose a coulee, built a little log cabin to be his home. We talked about it a little bit earlier. And this is it shortly after its construction, nicely covered in mud and whitewash on the outside. This is what it looks like today, remarkably still standing in some senses of still standing, I guess. But it gives you a sense of the size of these cabins. They tended to be very, very tiny. And when you consider that some of these Métis families were fairly large, they were living in fairly cramped conditions. And one of the things that my grandfather was able to do before he passed away is that he did a sort of a scale drawing of the cabin and how the furniture was arranged and how they lived in the space and what was in the space and what they had. And speaking with one of my archaeology friends, they were saying that this layout here is very similar to archaeological remains of Métis cabins, even in the Petiteville and Batoche areas. Very simple 19th century design. And I think it's interesting that that same style of cabin that had been made for about 100 years was still being constructed and lived in here in the Cypress Hills. And for quite a long time as well. This is Aunt Mary later in her life with her daughter Gladys. And this is the only interior photograph of that cabin, but it looks identical to the way my grandfather remembered it when his grandparents were still alive, and most of the furnishings were still there from the turn of the last century. And certainly in the Cypress Hills, there was lots of opportunities for hunting and trapping. This is Grandpa William with his winter's take of coyote and mink and ermine. The other thing that they would do is they would raise and break horses for the settlers that would be coming in. They would do timber work for the settlers that were coming in, cutting rails because they would need corrals and wood from the Cypress Hills. And then as the range started to be fenced, they would do custom fencing work for some of the ranches and farms in the area. On the domestic front, of course, they would do the typical things that you would imagine. That's Grandma Melanie there in her garden with Aunt Mary. They would grow vegetables and they would grow potatoes. And they would also harvest plants and medicines and berries in the Cypress Hills. And this was one of the things that my grandfather was telling me about, was the buffalo horn blueberry picker that his grandmother used. Blueberries in the Cypress Hills grow very low to the ground and they're very small and very difficult to pick. So they would take a buffalo horn, put a serrated edge on it, and they would use it to scoop up through the blueberry bushes, and then the berries would fall into the hollow of the horn, and then they would empty them out onto blankets. And what he said is his grandmother and all of the kids would shake these blankets up and down, and the wind would carry away leaves and whatnot and leave the blueberries in the blanket. Grandma Melanie continued to tan hides throughout her life in the cabin, in addition to the buffalo robes that served as comforters on the beds. There was also badger pelts on the floor as rugs, and she was tanning to make moccasins. And my grandfather indicated that throughout her life she continued to wear moccasins up until the day that she passed away. And when I asked him about other people in the community wearing moccasins, he said, well, a lot of the men started wearing boots, he said, but a lot of them had moccasins because they needed them for the Red River Jig. And so in the fur trade, there was this tradition of a New Year's Day levee. You know, there was a big celebration that would happen on New Year's Day. And this tradition of a New Year's Day levee, of course, you probably are familiar with the Lieutenant Governor's levee. That's certainly a direct event descendant of these levees that happened at these fur trade posts. But the Métis, interestingly enough, in the Cypress Hills, they continued this fur trade tradition of having a New Year's levee. And so they would gather together in a cabin in the Cypress Hills, and all of the furniture would be pushed out to the side, and they would bring out the fiddles and the spoons and the concertinas, and they would play the Red River Jig, and they would dance. And they would bring their moccasins specifically for that. And my grandfather said that he could remember, and when he was in his 90s, he could mimic the sound of the moccasins scuffing against the floorboards of these cabins. He remembered these parties where they were jigging here in the Cypress Hills. And the music at these levees, of course, would have been supplied by the Métis community themselves. They were famously adept at fiddle playing. Some of them played the guitar, concertina, the squeeze box like you see there, the spoons, and asked him what did they eat, you know, what was the food that they were eating at these parties. And he said, well, we were eating bullets. And I was like, well, what do you mean you're eating bullets? That seems very strange. And what he meant by bullets was boulette, which of course was a French word for meatballs. So they would have these big pots of meatballs and gravy, and that's what would feed everyone at these parties on the New Year's levees. And in the summertime, there would also be gatherings of the Métis in the Cypress Hills. They would gather together in an open, flat valley. Sometimes it was the old village site of Fort Walsh. And they would bring their tents and their stoves, and they would camp together, and they would visit, and they would sing, and they would dance, and they would do games and sports, and they would ride horses. And I think that the summer gathering was probably akin to like the Hills Are Alive festival, where the Métis gather in the Cypress Hills today on the Alberta side, or maybe like a miniature version of Back to Batoche. Now, one of the things that is interesting about Grandpa Henry's cabin is that it's not in its original location. Originally, it was further up the coulee from where it is located today. And many of the Métis that came back to the Cypress Hills to live in those coulees, they didn't homestead, which was unfortunate because in 1906, the Dominion Forest Reserves Act was passed, and the Dominion government selected a number of places across Canada that would be set aside as reserves for forestry. And the Cypress Hills was one of them. And when the Forest Reserve was created in the Cypress Hills, all of the Métis that were living within the boundaries of the Forest Reserve were compelled to leave. They were forced to dismantle their cabins and get out. And many of them just left. They headed up north into the Batoche and Battleford areas. But some of them did remain. Undaunted, Grandpa Henry took his cabin down one log at a time, put it on a wagon, carted it to the edge of this arbitrary boundary, which was the new forest reserve, and built it up again. So although it was unfortunate that the Métis were displaced by the creation of the forest reserve in the Cypress Hills, it did bring some opportunities again for work. This is Grandpa William, my grandfather's father, working at the forest reserve in the West Block in one of the cabins there. And he had the work of a general laborer. He would take care of the horses, he would put up hay, tend to the young trees that they were propagating, growing these trees in these nurseries. He also was responsible for building roads throughout the Cypress Hills, some of the first roads that went from Elkwater through to the center block. And it was important to build the road because the Forest Reserve manager had a Model T Ford that he needed to get up into the hills and then down into the Battle Creek Valley. So they built these switchback roads so this Model T could get in and out. And even for the older generation, Grandpa Henry here, there was contract opportunities. He was able to get contracts to go into the forest and collect pine cones. And the idea was that they'd fill these sacks with pine cones, bring them back to the Forest Reserve headquarters, and then they'd be able to take the seeds and propagate them in their nursery. My grandfather was fortunate enough to be taken out by his grandfather on some of these pine cone picking expeditions. You can remember them being in his very simple canvas tent, and in the evenings they would have a fire in a stove. But the stove that they took with them was light. It wasn't a cast iron stove. It was basically this. It was just a wash tub that had 3 holes cut into it. One of the holes was for the stovepipe that would go up through the roof of the canvas tent. One was a hole that the wood would be fed into for the fire and that the frying pan would go over top of. And the other hole at the front was the damper that you could put a piece of wood or something in front of to regulate the amount of air that was coming in. And that was their camp stove. And remarkably, it survives, and it's still with me today. One of the other things that happened, the RCMP came back to the Cypress Hills. They rebuilt Fort Walsh to be a remount ranch, raising horses for the RCMP musical ride. And they wanted these remount ranch buildings to be as much as possible like the buildings that were constructed by the Northwest Mounted Police in the 19th century. They wanted them to be essentially log cabins. So who better to be building log cabins in the Cypress Hills, but of course the Métis. And the fellow on the far right there, second to the far right, that's Barney Montour, Métis fellow from the Cypress Hills, and he was contracted by the RCMP to build the fort buildings. So when you go to Fort Walsh today and you see those log cabins there, they weren't built by the RCMP, but of course by the Métis of the Cypress Hills. My grandfather, as he got older, went into ranching as a young man, and then of course, as many young men did, joined the military at the beginning of the Second World War. He went overseas and attained the rank of sergeant, but he wasn't the first one in the family to join the military. His uncle Louis had gone to war during the First World War, the Great War. And one of the things I think that was also sometimes forgotten about or overlooked is the number of Métis veterans, the number of people that went overseas that were Indigenous or First Nations or Métis. When he came back as a war veteran, one of the things that he struggled with was the fact that he couldn't find work. And there was work to be had. He would go to businesses that would have help wanted signs, and he would go in and apply for the job, but they'd look him up and down and say, no, the job's been filled. And he knew that it hadn't been filled, and it was just because he was Métis that they weren't hiring him. He did manage to find sort of a menial labor job in a shale pit in Redcliffe, and he did that for a little while, but many of his co-workers, after work, all they wanted to do was go to the bar. And he was really quite concerned about falling into that pattern of drinking and kind of this pointless existence. And so he decided that working in town really wasn't going to be for him. There wasn't really a future in it. And he went back to his roots of cowboying in the Cypress Hills. And the ranching community was much more welcoming to the Métis. Certainly, again, there was that long-standing tradition of hiring a Métis as cowboys. And he had a successful career as a cowboy and a ranch foreman, ended up running one of the ranches for the Ross ranches on the Alberta side of the Cypress Hills, and was successful enough that he was able to actually buy his own ranch just below head of the mountain, just below Elkwater, and it was known as the 4-Bar T. And he operated that until he retired. Now, one of the things that he really never liked talking about throughout his life was his Métis heritage. And at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about wanting to fit in and wanting to fly under the radar. And he talked about his own parents. They could speak Michif, and they would speak it to each other, but they wouldn't speak it to the kids. So if they wanted to have a conversation the kids couldn't understand, they would speak Michif. But they refused to teach it to the kids because they didn't want them to have a different language. They didn't want them to have an accent. They didn't want them to stand out in any significant way. So it was a very conscious decision on their part not to share that part of their culture, their heritage with them. I think it was really quite unfortunate. And I think some of the encounters that he had, like being told, you know, there's no work for you here, get out, really colored his feeling about that identity. And he would always maintain that he was French Canadian. You know, he wasn't Métis. There wasn't that part to him. And I often wondered, you know, where did that come from? why was that it so common? It wasn't just him. A lot of Métis of his generation didn't really like talking about it. And I thought, perhaps some of it come from Batoche, the Battle of Batoche, and certainly the stigma that followed afterwards, that you were rebels, or you're criminals, you're somewhat bad people somehow, which I think is really unfortunate. And when I asked him, did your grandfather ever talk about 1885? Did he ever talk about the resistance? And he said, no, that was never a topic of conversation, which is perhaps understandable because a lot of people that were involved in conflict and war rarely like talking about their experiences. But Grandpa Henry actually wasn't directly involved in the Battle of Batoche. He wasn't actually involved in 1885. He maintains, at least in the government documents, that he sat out the conflict in Fort Qu'Appelle. However, that didn't necessarily mean that he was completely absolved because, of course, his cousin, Gabriel, was a Métis leader. His father and his two brothers were actively involved in the fighting at Batoche. And following the fall of Batoche, according to my grandfather's sister, Aunt Frances, when Gabriel Dumont famously escaped into the United States, it was believed that he came into the United States via the Cypress Hills, staying with family in the Cypress Hills area. And certainly when he did flee, two of Grandpa Henry's brothers went along with him, Louis and Francois. So the Northwest Mounted Police were on the lookout for these Métis that were fleeing into Montana following the fall of Batoche. And the Maple Creek Northwest Mounted Police Detachment was redoubling their efforts, patrolling through the Cypress Hills, looking for some of these rebels and refugees and so on and so forth. Fortunately, I guess they never did find them and they managed to escape into the United States. But I think perhaps for Grandpa Henry too, there was that sense of the stigma of being too closely associated that maybe he didn't want to talk about it. But anyway, fortunately, by the 1990s, the world was becoming a different place. My grandfather was starting to realize that there was a lot of people that were quite interested in his heritage and in the stories that he had to tell. And he began to embrace many of his Métis traditions and stories and whatnot that he had learned from his grandfather. And he even started building Red River carts, which I thought was really quite remarkable in his older years. And he donated them to a number of museums and historic sites throughout the area. And then ultimately he also wrote his memoirs, which was incredibly valuable to me and to anyone who's been able to read it. And not only does it just document his life, but it also is a snapshot and sort of a lens through which to look at the experience of a Métis family in the Cypress Hills in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So in the tradition of him sharing his stories, I've taken it upon myself now to share some of these stories as well, and try to bring some focus to this relatively unknown history of the Métis here in Southwest Saskatchewan. And hopefully you were able to learn a little bit about that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Royce. I could listen to you all evening. I so enjoy your stories, and you told some newer stories, different stories this evening, so it was really exciting to hear more about the history. We're going to turn it over to a question and answer period right now. So if you have, we're going to open the floor to anyone who has questions, and I think we'll have a few that maybe appear on the screen. Any questions? Certainly they can be directed at Royce directly. They can be directed at one of our elders if you wish. One question? Okay.
Anybody else? I have a question. You want to read?
Sure. I'll pass you the microphone so that we can, the people that are with us virtually can hear.
One question I have is, were the treaties seen as positive at the time that they were signed, or were they signed only because the First Nation or Métis felt they had no choice and they were obligated?
I think that might be a question for Larry, but my understanding is that in many cases it was because of the recognition that there was going to be a change coming, and in order to be prepared for that change, the treaties were seen as a way of creating a lasting relationship that would facilitate them in that change. They would learn, they would receive the education, they would receive the tools, they would receive the medicine. The idea was that it would be a partnership, and it never played out that way. And many of the chiefs saw that very early on. And so the ones that were at Fort Walsh that signed these treaty adhesions, particularly Big Bear, he refused to sign when Treaty 6 was signed at Fort Carleton, thank you, in 1876. And like I said, when he finally did give in and sign treaty, it was in December of 1882. And one of the interesting things with some of the early Treaty 4 adhesions that were signed at Fort Walsh is the Nakota that signed those treaties talked about the Mounties making a certain person a chief. And they didn't necessarily make somebody a chief, but what they ended up doing is arbitrarily they decided that if a headman could get a following of 100 people minimally, they could sign treaty on behalf of that 100 people. So what ended up happening in some cases, particularly with Big Bear's people, is he would get headmen to take the vulnerable, you know, the elderly, women and children, and become chiefs, sign treaty, and get the rations and the support, while the warriors and some of the other headmen would hold out, hoping for better terms. And of course, those never came. But I think Larry probably could speak better to that than I can.
No, that was very good. They really didn't have a choice in view of the fact that the buffalo were gone, right? Like when we say their livelihood, their lifestyle, people were actually starving. There was promises that were made in the treaty, you know, and but that didn't really come about as, you know, the way that it could have or should have. When you talk with somebody like a leader like Big Bear, his people are still looking for a place. They basically moved with other chiefs and their subsequent reservations, but they know that they're descendants of Big Bear. They have people in Great Falls, Havre, Montana, and North Battleford. They basically reside on the Little Pine Reserve, but every now and then they have a Big Bear gathering on the Little Pine Reserve, descendants of Chief Big Bear, and they talk of how can we get recognized as a tribe, as a reservation. So Big Bear was a holdout. He heard all the talk of all the happenings of the government, like, I don't know what you would call them, misdealings, or it just didn't happen the way that it was said, and so he had reservations, so he was wanting to do something else, but he never did get the chance. He just basically got ignored, and his people kind of went with other communities. So that's one chief. Like when we talk of our chief, that guy basically stayed in the hills. Kanit he was called. Everybody got relocated to different places, and when they say somebody like the Nakota, those are the descendants are the carry the kettle. They live in Sintoluda, between Sintoluda and Momart. What they say is when they got relocated from the Cypress Hills, they went back 3 times. I don't know how they relocated them, train or whatnot, but they moved them, or they forced them to move or whatever. But they kept going back. They went back 3 times, and then they talk of a train wreck in Mortlach. They had a train wreck, and so they decided, okay, we'll go over there. But as Royce said, yeah, things were changing over there. I guess the history books, like my late dad, his grandfather, I guess, would be somebody that was actually a young man at the talks in Fort Qu'Appelle. And those are some of the things, like the office of the Treaty Commissioner in Saskatoon. They formed an office to capture some of this information. He's the one who kept saying this kind of thing. And what that is that's what basically they negotiated for. The depth of a plot is what his interpretations of the words that the people that were, I guess that guy that attended that. So that was what the discussion was about. So all these resources that are basically part of the provincial government, there was a Natural Resource Transfer Act in 1931, where the federal government transferred to the province all the natural resources. So the First Nations people weren't part of that table. So that's our understanding. That basically that was it. But nonetheless, when we talk of reconciliation, the Indian Act was developed in 1876 and how to manage the indigenous population of the time, I guess. The residential schools were already in full effect in eastern Canada, moving this way. And if you look at Nikanit, I would venture to say we're probably the only reserve that doesn't have a church. I didn't know that. One time I was in Winnipeg or Ottawa, I can't remember, and they were talking about residential schools. And they were starting to come out with the harms that were caused. And I thought everybody was like us because, everybody's, traditional, they talk traditional, they're cultural, that's good. And I thought everybody was like us, that they followed their way and that was the only way they followed. I didn't know everybody was already indoctrinated into the other religion. And that's what I said, why don't you just shut the churches down and kick them out? Boy, there was silence, So I went out in the lobby after, and I didn't know how many residential schools there were across Canada. They had a map, they had all these pins, and that covered the whole country. So I recognized that's probably why the silence. Yeah, so that's I guess that's the fundamental difference of a place like Nikanit. We've never been, our people actually, our leaders actually forbade us to actually be involved in that. We had to stay with the way we were given by the Creator and the people that worked that way. So I would say that was a benefit to us, where we don't have that, we don't try to confuse or try to parallel our teachings with the Catholics or whatever. I notice other reserves, they start doing it, well, this way is similar to that. We don't have that kind of teaching. And being kind of the only Indian family in the early 60s that lived in town, we had ample opportunity to join the church organizations. But it was the teachings of our parents, grandparents that said, no, we have our own way. That's what we're given, that's what we'll follow. Yeah. So that's what, when I'm talking, that's what I'm talking about. It's probably a little different from other communities, and they did immerse themselves. We hear of other reserves that did go to residential schools that basically did the same thing. They would basically, they didn't talk Cree around their children. They didn't want their children to learn Cree. They wanted them to integrate for their survival. So I was just talking to one friend, and she's an investigator in Alberta. Her daughter is a lawyer in Calgary. The other daughter is a dentist. So that's what her parents did. They didn't even talk about residential school. They wanted them to get their education and go and basically make it in society. Our elder basically said his teaching is a team of horses. That's what he said is, yes, go get a good education. Go out there and make a living. But don't toss aside your spirituality. He said that's a good team of horses. Education and spirituality. So that's that could be one of the challenges of truth and reconciliation. How do we do both? And I said in my talk before, so far we really can't find an individual that has both to those type of degrees, because you have to commit time and effort to either one. If you want to get a good academic degree and get a good professional standing, chase the career, climb the ladder or whatever, you got to dedicate time. That's the same way in the traditional side. There's a ceremony going on. You're given tobacco, and we don't turn down tobacco. We talk to them first. We have a choice whether we accept it or not, but we do talk to them, and we accept it on a basis. Yeah, these people want help, I'll go help them. But as I said to other audience, we don't throw it away, we don't toss it aside. We don't say, well, my job with this ends at 5 o'clock, or I don't do this work on weekends. It's basically 24/7 until I'm able to pass it on to somebody else to carry on that work. And that's why I ask organization, you know, can you maybe even find somebody that, or employ somebody that we could mentor to learn some of these things that we're trying to teach organizations. I'm not trying to teach people teaching specific, but how to access those teachings. And working with the organization and you know, the First Nations way, I guess. So that's definitely a long answer to one question. But it's a long story.
It is a long story.
It is a long story.
And as Larry was,
you know, let's continue the effort. We'll figure it out. I'm not saying I know the answers, but together we'll figure out something. Yeah.
and as Larry was talking, one of the things that occurred to me, you were talking about, you know, did they do it because they wanted to or because they had to? When the bison disappeared and starvation set in the Cypress Hills, like Larry was saying, people were starving. The Northwest Mounted Police doctor would go around to the camps and he would tend to the people that were sick and that were starving. And he would come back to the Indian commissioner, who was Edgar Dewdney at the time, and he would say to Dewdney, you know, you need to do something for these people. Their condition is miserable. And that's what he said, their condition is miserable. And Dewdney's response was, the longer they hold out from signing treaty, the more miserable they will become. So hopefully that answers your question.
Are there any more questions?
There was a question that you had.
Dale's question?
Dale's question is here. Yeah, you want to?
I'll take the mic,
yeah.
I guess.
Oh, sure.
So my question, Royce, was I think it was on registration, and registration, and so is it applicable today? Like you showed your card up on the screen, so is it applicable today? I mean, if somebody from Scotland comes here and marries a Cree woman, is that
No.
that offspring is not that was my question. And the reason I say that, it comes from a personal point of view. I have the brightest, my grandson has the brightest orange hair ever. And when I found out, I said, in order to get red hair, the dad has to carry the gene as well as the mom. So in my family, if you look at me, on Royce's document, it says blue eyes. I have green eyes. My eyes color changes. When my wife gets me mad, I get this color and all that stuff. But that was my question. And your answer then is?
No, and that is a very good question. You know, people think that as soon as there's mixed blood, you're Métis, and that's not the case at all. To be Métis, you need to be a descendant of that original, unique, distinct culture that grew up around the Red River in Manitoba. So to be Métis, you need to be descendant of the historic Métis culture and community. If you, like you say, somebody from Niconeat marries someone from Scotland, their kids aren't Métis. You have to be descendant of the Métis nation to be Métis. And that's part of the criteria in getting your card. You know, and getting the card isn't really the easiest thing in the world either, because you have to go through exhaustive genealogical research, and you have to provide birth certificates and death certificates and marriage certificates, and you have to prove that you're a descendant of that historic Métis culture. But more importantly, you also have to be accepted by the Métis community, and that's the other test in that. It's not just enough to say you're Métis, you have to prove it through genealogical information, and you have to be accepted by the community.
I have just an interesting question.
You want to go there?
Oh, no, my, I wasn't sure if I should say this. It's just a quick question, because my kids always ask me this. Their dad is Norwegian, okay, and I'm a Cree from Treaty 6. And I think a lot of people ask this question because I've heard it asked in schools, Maverick, like, well, my dad is Native and my mom is white. So there's a confusion out there. My kids always ask me, especially my son, ask me, so if you're First Nations and dad is Norwegian, does that make me Métis? And I never know what to tell him, because I don't know the answer myself. And I just think, like when you just said that a lot of it has to do with historical, but I think there's a lot of people out there that wonder about that, if their parents are interracial marriages, right?
Yeah.
Can I offer a little bit of insight?
Yeah, there's, and Dale hopefully will explain it, but through the Indian Act, there's all sorts of crazy
Yes, and,
stuff.
and that's where I was going to go to. So I don't have my my card with me, but I have an Indian status card. And one of the things that we're finding out now is government, of course, is still what we talk about today. There's still that mindset there. So with your Indian status card, it doesn't give you all the information, because then there's a classification that comes along with that. So you're either a 6-1, which is meaning you're full status. But if you marry a non-native, your children become 6-2s. Yes, they're still, and so now this is where it kind of gets confusing. If a 6-2 marries a 6-1, then they have full status. But if that 6-2 marries a non-native, the offspring or the children are no longer status. Yes, so you have a little bit of duty to do. Make sure that your children are immersed in our culture, meaning taking the round dances, find a partner. So kind of get what I'm getting at. yeah, there you go. Yeah, 6-2s. Yeah, and that's what it is. So yeah, and that was one of the things. I guess I know we're kind of getting off topic here, but it's always of interest, right? There's a reason why this pops up. So our band, Larry, today we're class, like all the reserves in Canada have a number. So we are 380. So my treaty number is 3800009701. 97 being my band number. That's what classifies me as an individual from Niganit. But before that, we were, I believe, 160.
Yeah, 168.
We were 160A underneath another band. So this points of, I guess, interest, how that classification can be. And I think it's coming down the line where it's probably being changed. If you want to study, Indian affairs, turn on one of your channels. What the Senate, what some of their bills that they're going through. There are changes coming. And one of the things they do is when they document stuff like that, they say, "Oh, it's law now." Well, Larry being a politician and I being a former politician know that policies can change if it's 50% plus one, right? So meaning us, the people, have a little bit of work to do. Yeah. So I know that would be the answer to the Norwegian. We'd have a little bit of fun. Is there any? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you. The band still has to accept those sort of circumstantial cases as membership in that band. The federal government doesn't necessarily regulate some of that. The band has to accept those people that are, married 2 or 3 generations away as part of their band. Correct?
Yes, because with again going back to that number classification, so 3800, then at time of birth, then the mother and the dad have an obligation to, register that child. There are cases, and it's this is something that we're faced with almost on a daily basis, where some kids are not being registered, and I think that number is growing, because. I guess that duty or that obligation used to be done by somebody. It was probably the hospitals at the time, but now they're getting too busy doing other things. So they say, well, it's up to the mom now. And the mom, because of the social atmosphere that exists out there, sometimes they don't do that. But points of interest, it kind of, like you're defined by the government as what type of band you are too. A while back, we followed the band custom. So band custom was, like you mentioned, if somebody wanted to join our band, what we did was we posted it 4 times a year, and if you were, if you wanted to join our band, any one of them 4 dates throughout the year, you came and you made a presentation to the membership there, and whoever was in favor would put up their hand. So simple quorum. Yeah. And I was, I also recall though, there was other, like your chief and council have, like they're empowered as well. So they could actually, you could actually transfer from one band. So if you wanted to come from La Ronge or from another band and want to join ours, our chief could then make a band council resolution, ship it off to Ottawa, and then your status card would make that change. Yeah. So yeah, it's like I said, there's it's interesting what the registration is about. For me, my sons, same mom, same dad. I have one that's a 6'1", and my next son is a 6'2". So our Indian registry clerk at the time didn't do his duty, so now we probably have to do a little bit of follow-up with vital stats and all that. Yeah, and that's what we're telling all our kids now too. Part of our presentations that we do back home, we're telling the moms-to-be, whether they're coming through our healthcare or they're coming through our other parts of administration, we're saying, hey, make sure your child gets, all the paperwork is done, the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, all that stuff when it comes to registration. But yeah, going back to the round dance, my daughter right now, I said, when you go around, I said, here's all your relatives. Hey, a little bit of fun with that. Don't eat me, go have fun, go circulate. But here you got to remember, with our history, if you ever want to look at it, points of interest. The Hutterite colonies, I live about 2 or 3 miles away from a Hutterite colony, and they've developed quite the extensive, I guess it's a book about genealogy. And they've developed that for themselves. So when I go visit Sam says, okay, my daughter's going to get married. We're going to look over here. Here's all the family trees, and here's when they're going to marry somebody from way in Montana or Manitoba, right? They're able to do that. And I think in a sense, maybe that's what's happened with us as Indian registry people as well too. Yeah. So just, like I said, just areas of interest. Yeah. All right.
I have a question, Larry. Can one person belong to 2 bands at the same time? Is it possible? Or you have to give up your membership in one band in order to join another?
Yeah, there's actually the odd time where a person does belong to 2 bands. One of them is Shirley Wolf Keller. She was actually a chief of Fishing Lake and also Yellowcliff. I don't know how she did that. I've never talked to her for a long time, but there are people that belong to 2 bands. But when Dale's talking of registering children, the 6162, there are people that have lost their status, their family tree. Because their children, they basically, they get their status back through Bill C-31. But they're already immersed off reserve. They're living off reserve, and their children are, used to living off reserve. So they do find non-status partners. So they do lose their status. A lot of that stuff is pretty simple, because if there's anybody here with a rancher background, just look at the Angus cattle registration. It's basically similar as the registration we go through. Yeah, so there's no mystery there. They have to use something, right? Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things about belonging to bands and so on and so forth, historically, many of the Métis themselves would actually join bands. Like when I was talking about my great-great-grandfather's father, Vittel actually joined the One Arrow Band, and he actually was a headman for the One Arrow Band, and he received treaty annuity. And that was one of the things that they would always ask the Métis when they came to apply to get scrip. Do you identify as a Métis? Have you received treaty annuity through an Indian band? And so my great-great-grandfather, when he took scrip, he said, well, yes, my father is a headman on One Arrow. He has received treaty annuity. When I was younger, he took treaty annuity for me, but I identify as Métis. I'm applying for scrip. And some of his Grandpa Henry's brothers, like Francois and Louis, that were active in the rail resistance, they also were taking treaty annuity through One Arrow. So there was a lot of muddiness even between First Nations and Métis during that period of scrip and treaty.
A lot of the families, Métis families, of course, in Saskatchewan have relatives and connections to the United States. There was a period in the U.S. history as well where they didn't identify, the classification of Métis was not accepted. Either you had to choose to be First Nations or white. Now, I don't know how long that lasts, if they're still in place, but are there Métis that have connections with Saskatchewan that perhaps are coming into Canada and want to get Métis status? And how does that work, you know?
That would be a question for Wendy, and unfortunately she wasn't able to be with us here this evening, so I'm not too familiar with it. But you know, the thing that's interesting about the United States, you know, they're always so proud of you know, the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Corps of Discovery and so on and so forth. And they were meeting all of these First Nations that had French names, you know, the Nez Perce and the Pendant Doré and all of these places that had French names. And where do you suppose that was? You know, maybe the Americans weren't the first ones out there naming things. Certainly the French voyageurs, the fur traders, and the Métis would have had a fairly significant presence in the western part of the United States before the Americans.
Any more questions? How do you feel about your Métis identity today? You.
Well,
You can decline.
no, we weren't brought up with any knowledge of it, you know. In fact, because my grandfather wouldn't talk about it, it was never discussed. So we really didn't have a really clear sense of what that meant. And I can remember when I finally figured it out, and of course when you're a kid you're stupid because, you know, my grandfather looked different and he sounded different and so on and so forth, and we knew something was up, but, you know, just he's grandfather. But when we started to learn about the 1885 resistance in school, our school teacher was talking about Gabriel Dumont and Louis Riel and the 1885 resistance, and talking about how the Métis, you know, continue to exist to this day, even in this community, and there are descendants here among our community today. And he kind of looked at me, and I was like, So I got on the school bus and I went home, and my mother was at the counter and she was doing some sort of baking. And I came in and I said, "So, Mom, are you Métis?" And she just froze. And there was this really horrible, awkward silence. And she finally looked up and she said, "Yes," but she said, "Never use the M word in front of your grandfather," because that was taboo subject. So it was always awkward because I was always curious and I always wanted to know more. But I knew that I was forbidden from my mother to talk about it. And that's why I was saying in the presentation, you know, fortunately, you know, by the late 90s, mid 90s, he was becoming more comfortable talking about it. So that was the opportunity to start asking these questions. And fortunately, he lived a long life, and he lived into that period when, you know, he was past the stigma and could start sharing those stories. So I feel personally that I'm still learning.
And do you have children?
No, no. Nieces and nephews, but they've I've been trying to pass some of that on to them as well, but they're quite young yet. Actually today, in between presentations, you know, I showed that one slide of Grandpa Henry's brother Alexander that was born at Fort Walsh in 1879. My grandfather's middle name was Alexander, and my brother's first name is Alexander. So it's interesting how these names percolate down through history.
More questions?
Oh.
Such a delightful, informative day. Thank you for doing 2 presentations, and every presentation was so, you know, heart-rendering. and we came to know so much about the Métis history. Thank you, Royce. That is coming from my heart, and just how Tanisha said, that they're getting good reviews, that how many people on Facebook is saying how good it has been. So, very good. Thank you. We're very grateful to you, to Elder Larry, and also to Elder Dale, all of you, and Sylvia. She's a member. Often I forget to thank her as an elder, but all of you have been such great leaders for us in this journey. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and supporting this mission of ours.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just had to do it spontaneously.
You know what?
If
you,
I could not.
Aren't on the road, you'll be on the road because people will want to hear what you have to say. You've got a lot to say. Yeah, it's good.
You may have talked yourself into a speaking
That's
engagement.
exactly what I just said.
A bunch of
What did he say?
You've talked yourself into a speaking
people that
engagement
think
because
they're
people are
very
going to want to
important,
hear.
so watch out.
Already.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, I guess I should give back my microphone. Yeah. Yeah. I just about forgot it was there. And get home and I'd be like,
So
no,
much.
sure, anytime. If there's anything that you'd like me to do, I'd be happy to.
Take care.
Thank you.